Hello, and welcome to this lecture on argumentation and revolution. What we're going to look at in this lecture is one of the first big revolutionary documents, that is, the American Declaration of Independence. We'll look here at some of the background to the American Declaration of Independence, and we'll look at why the Declaration of Independence was written and was put together. What we're interested in then is the ways in which the British Empire in North America was replaced by what became the United States of America. So we'll look at this process of state formation through revolution. The Americans are very proud of their revolutionary history. They're very proud of their founding documents, and the American Declaration of Independence is one of these most powerful founding documents. So what is the American Declaration of Independence? Well, put simply, it's a piece of propaganda. It is a piece of writing, a piece of argumentative writing that is looking to persuade readers, looking to persuade listeners of the justification of the Americans' Declaration of Independence. It is looking to persuade fellow Americans that this declaration is true and valid and something that needs to be done. And it's looking to persuade British people that the Americans' revolution, the Americans' revolt, is again something that is justified. And it's looking to persuade foreign powers, especially France and Spain, of the justification of the American claim. The document here then is a document that tries to justify and explain why the Americans declared independence. So let's look then at why the Americans declared independence. So the Declaration itself was written in 1776. In order to understand some of why this came to be, why it happened in 1776, we have to go back a little. We go back to 1763. In 1763, the British Empire, in red here, looked something like this. Great Britain, in Europe, controlled a vast portion of North America, what we would now call America and Canada. Britain had numerous other islands in Jamaica, the Virgin Islands, Bermuda, and was starting to colonise in India. So the British Empire in 1763 looked like this. What had happened just at this point, just before 1763, was what was called the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War was a war between Britain and France, primarily, and the war was over who controlled this land in North America, so what we now call Canada. The French had owned Canada, and in the 7 Years' War, Britain and France had fought over who was dominant in North America. The British colonies in North America were becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly important, and the French were trying to take some of that power and authority away from the British. So you had a 7 Years' War. This is the first European war that is fought predominantly in the New World, in America. And it's predominantly between Britain and France. The British colonists in North America fought alongside their British troops. So what you had at the end of the war then was a map of North America that looked something like this. You had the yellow territories, which were the British claims. So you can see that Britain controlled a vast portion of North America. You had the French claims, which had initially run across Canada, across Quebec in the top, but the French claims in North America, as you can see, are now very, very limited. And then you have the Spanish that control New Spain and Louisiana. And then what is now Alaska, you have some control from the Russians. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain then took control of this large, large portion of North America. The British colonies had already been established. So if you note the red line here, the colonies within that red line, the 13 original colonies, outside of that red line was called what was beyond the proclamation line. So in 1763, the Proclamation Line, which is this red line, barred further British settlement out into lands that were owned or occupied by Native Americans. So the British colonists were in those colonies, and then outside of those lands, even though they were claimed by the British, they were not directly governed by the British. They were held, they were occupied, they belonged to Native Americans. So this is the situation at the end of the 7 Years' War, 1763. At this point, Britain looked to create a permanent standing army, a permanent army in North America. This is the first time this had happened in the British colonies. Normally, in British history, you have an army that is raised only when war is called. And then at the end of the war, the army is disbanded. At the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government took the view that they had to maintain a permanent army in North America. This was for two reasons, or perhaps three, but this was for two reasons. Firstly, it was to defend the British colonies against what the British government thought would be further French aggression. The British thought the French were going to attack again. Secondly, it was to defend the British colonists against Native American uprisings and against Native American attacks. And then thirdly, eventually, it was used to defend British rights against American revolutionaries. So, what had happened then had been a very expensive, very long, 7 years long war. And in the aftermath of the war, British politicians, so you can see here them debating in the Westminster, the British Parliament, British politicians looked to regain some of the lost revenue, some of the lost money that they had made, or that they had lost, through the 7 Years' War. They also sought to standardise systems across this vast, growing British Empire. They sought to draw in money and taxation across the empire to be able to profit from the colonies. This, however, caused some tensions, and we'll come back to that. So British North America then looked like this. You had the 13 original colonies. They go from New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the north, down through New York and Pennsylvania, into Virginia, South Carolina and Georgia. These are the 13 colonies. You then had, as we were discussing, the Proclamation Line, and behind that was the Indian Reserve. And then in the north, you had Quebec. Each one of these colonies had their own local assembly or their own local parliament. Each one of those colonies had their own elected representatives. But each one of those colonies was centrally governed by those politicians in Westminster. And this is the crux. This is where the tensions between Britain and America really start. So you had colonies in America with their own parliaments. Their own parliaments could raise taxes, their own parliaments could raise militiamen, their own parliaments could import duties. The British government in Westminster, several thousand miles away, could also raise taxes, could also raise armies. And so there was tension between the parliaments in America and Westminster. And the American Revolution is fundamentally about a disagreement over who governs the American people at this time. The way the British viewed it was, as one of the politicians, Edmund Burke, said, was that the Westminster Parliament governed as from the throne of heaven. So, in their view, the Westminster government was able to sit at the top and sit centrally and guide and govern all the colonies of the British Empire. The Americans, however, viewed that their own assemblies, their local parliaments, had become equal to Westminster, had become equal to the Parliament in London. And so the way that they viewed it was that the British King, King George III, had numerous different parliaments within his domains. He had a parliament in London for the British Isles. He had an assembly in New York for New York. But they didn't want this disagreement between, or this contest between parliamentary powers. But the American Revolution then is all about this. So what the British were trying to do then is trying from Great Britain to organise, standardise and raise money from the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies had become exceptionally rich, exceptionally wealthy. They were one of the greatest sources of wealth. This is because the 13 colonies, especially in the southern colonies, so colonies like South Carolina, Georgia and Virginia, could grow substantial volumes of crops, tobacco and sugar. This was done using slavery. These colonies then could produce vast quantities of goods that the British needed and the British could make money off of. And so what the British looked to do then was start to raise money, raise revenue from the colonies. And they did this by trying to impose taxes. So in 1764, one of the first acts was the Sugar Act. This was a tax on sugar in America. Second Act was Currency Act, 1764. This was an attempt to try and regulate and control American local currencies. You then had the Quartering Act, which was about the British government trying to control where troops were stationed, where troops were quartered. And then in 1765, you had the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a duty on transactions in the colonies. It was a duty on legal documents in the colonies. And then in 1773, you had what was called the Tea Act, and this was a tax on tea. Now, there are two significant distinctions here. The earlier acts, so 1764, the Sugar Act, that was a tax on internal products. The sugar was made in America, and it was consumed in America. The British government had tried to tax a thing that was made and consumed in America. And the Americans rejected that. They said that the British government had no authority, no right to tax goods that existed and were made and produced and consumed inside America. The British government backed down and accepted that. By 1773 then, what the British government were looking to do was tax goods coming into America. So the tea in the Tea Act came from India. And the British government said, in essence, that the Americans had opposed the Sugar Act, had opposed those internal taxes, but had not mentioned external taxes. So they had not mentioned any objection to taxes on goods coming into North America. However, in 1773, with the Tea Act, you had the Americans protesting. There are two other big events that happen here. In 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. Boston is in Massachusetts, and you have here a massacre of American or Bostonian citizens by British troops. There is disagreement and debate over who fired the first shot or who threw the first stone, but what you had is a group of unarmed Americans eventually being fired upon by armed British troops. In images like this, you can always tell the British troops because the British troops were known as redcoats. So the British armed forces always wore red. Then in 1773, as a result of this Tea Act, when that tea arrived in Boston, you had what was called the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was when a group of Americans, a group of Bostonians, boarded some of the ships that were carrying the tea and threw the tea overboard. So in protest of what the British had done of trying to tax that tea, instead of allowing it to land and be taxed, they threw it overboard into the sea. These tensions culminated, and by 1775, you had one of the first battles of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And again, if you look here, you can see the British redcoats in the background in red. The battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775 kicked off the War of the American Revolution. And that resulted also in 1775 in the Proclamation of Rebellion. King George III, in the photo here, King George III declared that the Americans were in open rebellion. He did this because it meant that he could then impose military rule. He could then use the British Armed Forces to try to subdue the American revolutionaries. And so this is 1775. What happens then is by 1776, we have the Americans' Declaration of Independence. It is not until this point that the Americans are really genuinely openly talking about a full Declaration of Independence, a full separation from Great Britain. And this is important. Countries hadn't done this before. This was new. This discussion, this debate, this justification, this argument was new. And what the Americans do here in the Declaration of Independence is try to lay out the reasons for why the United States of America should break from the United Kingdom. So who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Well, it was written very quickly in July 1776. And initially, a committee of 5 were tasked with drafting the Declaration. You can see here 3 of them. So you had men like John Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson here became increasingly important. Jefferson was important for 2 reasons. Firstly, he was an excellent author. His writing was seen to be very clever, very erudite, and very well done. And secondly, and importantly, he was from Virginia. Virginia was one of the biggest, the richest, and the most powerful colonies at the time. So this committee of 5 were initially tasked with drafting this declaration. They were initially tasked with putting together the first American Declaration of Independence. Ultimately, Thomas Jefferson, here in the green, became the lead author of the Declaration. The Declaration is his work. It is his voice. When we read the words of the Declaration of Independence, we read the words mostly of Thomas Jefferson. And I emphasise mostly. In July then, the Declaration of Independence was debated and edited over several days in the American Continental Congress. And what you can see here is the Continental Congress in debate. The Congress debated and edited this document over several days. Thomas Jefferson claimed that the Congress had mangled his document. Jefferson had included, for example, references to slavery and the slave trade. Jefferson had said that the British had imposed slavery and the slave trade on the free Americans. This was really problematic, especially for the other southern states, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, because many of these men were themselves slave owners. So what we have then is a document mostly written by Thomas Jefferson, but not entirely, but mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. And then one that is edited and, in Jefferson's word, mangled over the course of several days. What we have then is the Resolution of Independence was adopted on the 2nd of July 1776. And that resolution was then announced to the American public on the 4th of July 1776. And that's the day, to this day, that Americans celebrate as Independence Day. Their Independence Day is the 4th of July 1776. And that's because of this Declaration of Independence. So initially, the Declaration of Independence was unimportant to the Americans. The important thing had been winning the war. And America went on to win the war and gain its independence from the UK, from Britain, in 1783. After that, the Americans went on to write their own constitution, form their own natures of government. And it was only after that point, as Americans looked back to try to understand where their country had come from, how their country had been born, that the importance of the American Declaration of Independence came more to the fore. And so that means that you had, for example, by the 19th century, you had famous American presidents like Abraham Lincoln talking about the American Declaration of Independence. When Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address says 7 years ago, what he is referring to is 1776. He's referring to the Declaration of Independence. So this Declaration of Independence and the wording that was used here has become so influential and so important in American and in Western political thought. Phrases like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are commonly used. When in the course of human events is how the document starts. And the document then goes on to categorize and discuss American independence not as a debate over who can tax whom, but over a debate of the rights of mankind, the freedoms and the liberties of mankind. And so what this document looks to do is take those, some would say, quite petty arguments over taxation and expand that out into a discussion around about the tyrannical nature of the British government. So when you're looking at the Declaration of Independence, when you're looking at it as a document, keep in mind three things. Firstly, it was a piece of propaganda. It's a piece of propaganda that aims to argue for the reasons why the Americans should declare independence. Secondly, it's a document that was edited, it's a document that was debated, and it's a document that was changed over time. So the document that we see of public or announced on the 4th of July is one that had gone through multiple drafts. And thirdly, the importance of this document and the ideas within this document are significant and are very crucial in the development of the American identity and in the development of freedom, the approach to freedom in the West. But there are also issues here around about hyperbole, about expansion of the argument to make the needs of that first point of it being a piece of propaganda. So look at the document, read the document, keep those things in mind. Keep in mind that it's propaganda, keep in mind that it was written by a committee, and keep in mind that some of the statements are exaggerated to meet a political end and a political point.